now. And a special welcome to Doug for being with us. Doug is a pastor, author, business owner, speaker, consultant, and radio show host. And I know he's done things like this before, so the technology is not new to him. He seeks, in his own words, to be a social and theological entrepreneur and goodness conspirator. And I really like that. I like those words a lot, and makes you think about what our role is as Christians and people of faith in our broader culture. You may have heard of him through his work at Solomon's Porch or the social network Emergent Village. So we're happy to have Doug here with us, and Doug, I'm very excited to hear from you on your topic, preaching in the Inventive Age. I'm going to go offline now, and I will still be here in the background if anyone has any questions or comments for me. My image won't be visible, but I will still be here. So thanks very much, Doug.
Great, thanks a lot. And I control the clicking of the slide. So if anyone needs me to go back or something else, or if you want to talk about any of the pieces in the presentation today, please do let me know. I'm broadcasting out of my home office and a little radio studio as well. I do a radio show, weekly radio show on Spreaker Radio and on Ustream. So there's a video version of it. So that's what that banner is behind you, is the radio show banner. So it's DougPagittRadio.com. And so I'm at my house. I don't know where all of you are in your listening, if you're in offices or if you're in your own home working environments. And you'll see on the screen right now, if you want to be in touch with me on Facebook or on Twitter, or if you're really old school and you want to go email, you could do that as well. And then there's two websites, one for my own website and the radio show website. As was mentioned, I'm part of a church called Solomon's Porch, and we're in Minneapolis, and we're a 12-year-old, I guess almost 13 now, 13-year-old church that's populated with all kinds of interesting folks, artists, engineers, athletes, social do-gooders, people from lots of backgrounds. And we're about a 300-person community with many children, and we meet in a building, and I'll describe some of that to you in a bit. And I do keep an office there, but I also office from home. And I don't bring that up just to let you know the setting that I'm in, but I think there's something important about that. For many of us, I think we're seeing some of the changes that are happening in work environments, in business as a whole, and also most certainly in religion. And those kinds of changes, I think, are consequential. I'm one who holds that culture is made up of four components, and I'm going to take you on a little cultural primer today. But I think that it matters in the fact that people work from home, that many people work for themselves, or people can telecommute, or people are working while they're carrying their phone and they're in line at a restaurant or a coffee shop, or they're able to sit at their kids' band concert or sporting event, and they're able to do their work. So we have started to cross again the streams that have in the industrial age and in the information age have been dividing. We've been able to cross these together. So I think that matters. And in that sense, I'm interested to know if you all could just let me know right now, and I guess typing it in is the best way to do it. Where are you right now? Like not in some sort of a metaphoric sense of where's your life right now, but are you at home? Are you in an office? Are you in a home office? Are you in a public place? So if you'd all sort of let that roll, I'll keep going with the presentation. But if you're willing to type in at this point where you are, I would appreciate that. And then as we go through our conversation, I may be asking you for some input on the places where you find yourself. So so we'll take it like that if we could. This is the church building that Solomon's Porch meets in. We're on the corner of 46th Street and Blaisdell Avenue in South Minneapolis. And you can see that the building was built with a certain artistic and architectural sensibility, right? It looks like an English castle. And why in the 1930s we decided to build why the Methodists, who were the originators of this building, built a building that looks like a English castle, I think is important and kind of matters in the world, right? There was a certain sensibility that they were going for and a certain narrative that they were trying to tell. Now, I should make it clear that billboard is not actually on the building. So we had someone put together a little presentation for us on one of our anniversaries. I think it was our 10th anniversary, and so he was sort of putting up a McDonald's like 1 billion hamburgers served sensibility. But I like to use that slide because I think it's a good reminder that what you see in pictures isn't always fully accurate, right? Pictures are a moment in time. They're a capture of what was going on at a moment, but they're not the dynamic lived experience. So I'm going to show you a bunch of pictures of the life of Solomon's Porch, and just know that sometimes pictures can create a reality that is as accurate as a lived experience, and sometimes not. But none of the rest of the pictures are photoshopped, so only that one. So this is the building. You can see that it's got this front door, green front door. That's what separates it from the Episcopalian friends of mine, is that our door is green, theirs are red. So an English castle-looking building. When we moved into the building, this is what it looked like. This is a shot standing from the stage and looking back toward the balcony. That is a balcony on the upper level there, in the back, and there's some ceiling fans, and then rows of pews with a red rug down the middle, looking fairly typical. And then there's this gate. There's a wrought iron gate right there in the middle, and I guess that was what was designed to separate the gated community from the rest of the people. And that gate would swing shut, and on the front of it there were places for communion to be served, so people would come up and would kneel and receive their communion there. That's an extremely powerful socializing element, isn't it? When you really think about what was going on in a church building, and how there was this gate that could open and shut, and the choir and the pulpit was on one side of the gate and the people sat on the other. I bring that up because I'm going to suggest that the tools that we use in our culture are extremely powerful, and the tools that we use in our church form and shape culture in a particular way. So this is a conversation about preaching, but I want to suggest to you that preaching is an activity that is a part of an entire cultural sensibility within a church. And so I'm going to suggest a kind of preaching that involves a dynamism and interaction and requires contribution from all participants. And I think the physical environments that we find ourselves in lend toward that, or sometimes make that more difficult. So this is a shot from the balcony. You can see that this was a Methodist church building, and we stumbled onto it on an American website called Craigslist, which is a place where people sell couches and advertise for apartments for rent and that kind of thing. But also a church building was on there. So when we moved in, it wasn't being occupied by a Methodist congregation at the time. They were seeking to rent it, but it still had the pews. It still had the Bibles and still had the hymnals set there in pretty straight order. And this is what it looked like from the aisle, looking up at that gated community area where there was the piano and the cross and the flags. That's a big deal in a lot of American religion, to have flags, American flags, and sometimes also flags from other countries and from religious, and they would have religious meeting. Our community that then moved into this building doesn't have a use of flags like that. So yeah, I see that when he's asking a question, yes, the church building, this church building was listed on Craigslist. The woman who was in charge of trying to get rentals for the building said that she was having a hard time using the church systems to find a renter, and we were a church that was having a hard time using the church system to find a church building. And somebody in our community said to me, "Hey, have you ever looked on Craigslist for a church?" And I said to her, "Britt, look, that's like there's a whole other system by which we church people do our church things, and I'm in touch with all those people as the professional, and that's just probably not where we're going to find a church. So no, I haven't looked. And the next day she sent me a link and said, well, how about this building? And it was this one that the woman who was listing it had the same sensibility that Britt did, which was to get outside of the typical church structures and to list it on Craigslist, which I thought was genius. This is what the building looks like now. So we redesigned it. We moved the speaking area from up on the gated community spot up on the upper left there where the cross is down to the middle. We took out the pews. We fitted it with household furnitures. It looks as much like a coffee shop as anything else, but it is in a church building. You can see that it's, it still has a church building sensibility with stained glass. And then we hung up art, we hung screens, we projected to the sides, and we oriented the building around the center where people are facing one another. And that has created a real change dynamic where people are in the center of a room if they need to talk to the whole room for any length of time. Sometimes you're because a speaker from the center, as I'm doing in this image, is sitting with their back to everyone. That creates a particular kind of dynamic where people can see one another as much as they can see the face of a person who's talking for any length of time. And that's an important dynamic that I'm going to suggest in the preaching model, is that preaching become a communal act and not just a speech-making act held by one person. And what I'm going to suggest about preaching is that preaching ought to be not just a question of delivery, but a question of who owns the content. So I'm going to suggest a thing called progressional implicatory dialogue, which is what I call it in my book, Preaching in the Inventive Age. And the real power of that is not just the style, but also the origination of the material and who owns the preaching material. And I think preaching is really, really important, and is so important that we have to free it from the preaching. We have to free preaching from the speech-making activity. So the physical environment has something to do with that. Here's now a picture from the back way up on the platform, looking up toward the balcony. So same building, but now is being utilized in some really different ways. And we do communion every week, and we set it all around on there's probably 5 or 6 different stations for communion, and communion becomes an interaction for all of us. I can see that Wendy's asking if there's these images are available on our website, and they're not. I don't think, not all of these anyway. But if you would be interested in receiving this PowerPoint that I'm sending you, that I'm using here, I'd be glad to send it to you. So I guess you could list your information there, or maybe we could just find a way to send it to all the people who've registered for the seminar. So you could use it to look like that, to look at or to show people. So you can see that sometimes people stand. I sit. I'm quite tall. I'm 6'7". So in a room where people are sitting on couches around you, Carol, who's about 5'2" right there, can stand quite comfortably. When I stand, it feels like I'm dominating over people. So I tend to sit just like other people do. But this is what our building looks like now. There's a particular dynamic to all of this that I want to chase after for you. These were just a bunch of pictures that I clicked real quick on one night. So I try to write about this idea of inventive age-ness, and I'm going to walk you through what I mean by inventive age. And I've written 4 books that talk about 4 elements of church life in the inventive age. One of them called Church in the Inventive Age. How do we think about church as an inventive age element? And then community, formation of community in the inventive age, evangelism in the inventive age, and then our conversation for today, which is preaching in the inventive age. So if the webinar format's great and fine and all you need, then on preaching, then our conversation today might suffice. If you're somebody who also likes books, places where they sell books online, and book retailers very well will may carry these 4 books. So if these ideas seem intriguing to you and you want to get into them in the book form, those are available for you. So I'd like to take you on a little anthropological tutoring, if I could, for a moment. I was an anthropology major in college, and I still think that the way we think about the world shapes how we experience the world. So I'd like to take you on a little 150-year history of the United States and Canada, if I could. Now, I'm speaking from a United States perspective, so those of you who are in Canada can correct me as I need to be corrected for the Canadian experience. But I would suggest that we're in the fourth cultural age of North American history. The first being the Agrarian Age. Then I think we transitioned to the Industrial Age, then to the Information Age, and now I'm suggesting that we're in the Inventive Age. And by these ages, I mean something in particular. I mean that there's a cultural set of understandings and assumptions, and they're going to come in four parts. I'll say this again in a moment, so if you're needing to keep track of this for some reason, I will repeat this in a moment. But I think that the four cultural elements that make an age are how people think, and I point to the head, how people value, I point to the heart, what aesthetics people appreciate, the gut, and then what tools people use, and I use the hand. So culture is shaped by way we think, values, aesthetics, and tools, and they all matter. And when you have a transition in all four areas, how people think, what they value, the aesthetics, and the tools, then you're into a different cultural age. So when I talk about there being a transition from one age to the next, that's what I'm referring to, is that we've had a shift in thinking, values, aesthetics, and tools that are enough to sort of put us in a different period. It's similar to what someone might experience if they were to travel cross-culturally to another country or to another culture, or even within a country, you could have the same experience. You know that you're in a place where there's different languages being used in thinking, where how people choose to organize their lives and value systems are different, where there's different smells and sounds, and then where there's different artifacts of that culture. So you get this within cultures inside of the same country, and then also within other countries. So we're fairly adaptive, in the world that we live in now, to changing culture. And I think, that it also happens over time. So I would suggest that we have these four cultural periods. Now, I do want to say at the start that I think that the nature of these epochs or these cultural ages is that they exist simultaneously, right? We're not done with the Agrarian Age. There's still an Agrarian Age. We're not finished with information. Of course, there's still Information Age. But they build upon one another to generate something new, and they have unique reward systems. So what I want to argue is that every cultural period produces a cultural artifacts, and churches and religion are cultural artifacts. So I believe that there's an expression of church that is purely Agrarian Age, fits it very well. There's an expression of church that is highly industrial aged. I would suggest to you that that's modern day denominations. Our modern day denominational system was created during the industrial age with industrial age sensibilities and ways of thinking. And then there's the Information Age churches. Evangelicalism reflects Information Age churches. And I think we're developing a new cultural sensibilities, and will create new cultural artifacts, including new kinds of church, maybe even new kinds of religious life that happen within the industrial, or within the Inventive Age. All right, so a little bit more on the Agrarian Age. The Agrarian Age in North American culture might be summed up very well in the Laura Ingalls Wilder sensibilities. People living on farms, taking care of one another, paw and mog, digging up out of the ground what they need, building things by hand. And in this age, people tended to live within a single culture. That Agrarian Age tends to be people from a particular cultural environment living with one another, one language, one way of organizing, one sensibility, working very close to the ground, engaging with life at a very tactile kind of level. Well, there's a church that fit that age very well. The Agrarian Age Church has a set of tools. It has churches that look just like rural North America, and it has pastoral outfits that even look like the Agrarian Age, where a pastor gets to dress like a shepherd and gets to wear a shepherd's stole. I mean, totally would have made sense in Agrarian Age sensibilities. And in the Agrarian Age church life, you would often have a single church, maybe a Protestant and a Catholic church, at least in the United States, but you would have a church life that reflected and looked a lot like agrarian sensibilities. In fact, even the time when churches meet are arranged on Sundays to fit the agrarian schedule. So churches would not meet too early in the morning, but not too late in the afternoon. They would meet after milking of the cows could take place. And so the Agrarian Age sensibility of the Agrarian Age Church, very often organized around parish model. The parish model church for Catholics and Anglicans was quite powerful. The division between one church and the next was where you were located. And there's still a lot of churches that are organized by their proximity to one another. So that's an Agrarian Age church and sensibility. Well, the Industrial Age brings about changes. It moves people from rural environments to urban environments. And so people start moving into cities. When industrialization brings people away from the farm, it brings them to the factory. So no longer is the farm the center of life in the Agrarian Age, but it is the factory. People find their meaning in their work, not in their location. And so the factory becomes the normative model for people's organizing and for arranging. So there's cities all over North America that are organized around industrial aged culture. And in the Industrial Age culture, it's what you produce that's most important, not where you're from. And so there's a particular church that's created in the Industrial Age. The church building that we're in, this is another pictorial example of this as well. And the sensibilities that are developing in Industrial Age culture for religion is that now churches are one expression on one street corner, and you'll have other versions of churches on other street corners. One of the things that urbanization brought and industrialization brought was people from different communities now living side by side with one another. So industrialized culture creates a side-by-side kind of reality. And so now you have people who are having to not just experience a monocultural experience in the Agrarian Age that's only where churches are divided by their location, but now you have to represent the particular brand of that church in comparison to other versions of Christianity. So the Industrial Age Church was the perfect situation for modern day denominationalism, where the clergy becomes the person who represents not only the entire town, but represents their particular brand. So we have a kind of preaching that takes place where organizing your thoughts and your community around your denominational specificity became more and more important. How do you represent your brand distinctive from the other brands? That's not a skill set that people had to have in the Agrarian Age. So pastors went through a dramatic shift from the pastoral age of being the shepherd of all the people in town to being the brand representative in a community that's sitting side by side other communities. Well, the Information Age then comes about for lots of reasons, and because of the creativity and the inventions that came out of the Industrial Age. Textbooks, schools, television, radio, newspapers, all these things that were created in the Industrial Age then generated the Information Age. And the Information Age is no longer built around the farm, and it's not built around the factory, it's built around the school. So it's in the school that we find the centering activities. So new suburbs that are developing in the Information Age in the United States and from the late 1940s through the 1950s and 1960s, people don't ask, well, what's the industry in that new suburb? They ask, how good are the schools in that new suburb? And so knowledge is power in this age. This is where it's not where you're from like it was in the Industrial or like it was in the Agrarian Age. It's not what do you produce like it was in the Industrial Age. It is what do you know that matters. This is the age that produces evangelicalism. Evangelicalism is a religious expression in North America that said your denominational background isn't important as long as you know the four spiritual laws, the steps to peace with God. The whole arrangement of evangelicalism was built around content delivery and having Christianity be the most basic that it could be, regardless of your particular denominational backgrounds. So the Agrarian Age gave us the parish model churches. The Industrial Age gave us the denominational model churches. And The Information Age gives us the evangelical sensibility churches, where every church now starts to add an education wing. Right, we can see it in the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s. These church buildings are adding on a Sunday school building or an education wing, and it was important for children, for sure. That children now are being taught in information delivery systems. Often people sitting in rows and children looking an awful lot like the church building that I showed earlier. Now, modern day education says you don't put kids in row and have them face a blackboard and write things up on the blackboard. Instead, you create learning pods and learning environments. So what I'm going to suggest about how churches should function in the Inventive Age is much more around learning communities than it is around knowledge delivery systems. But it wasn't just true of churches or of children in churches, it was also true of adults in churches. And so adult education took off, where people then sat in rows and faced a man wearing a sweater vest and standing up in front of a television on a tippy cart with a VCR in it. Very common. I worked at a church where we would have conversations quite regularly in our staff meetings about the safety of the carts that had a television. Like every room had a television on them. It was intriguing. Our Industrial Age Church building that our church meets in was Methodist, and the Methodists were very good at education, and they put a chalkboard in every room, literally every single room, even storage closets, chalkboards. Well, evangelicals wouldn't just put up a chalkboard; they would put a TV screen or a video screen, so you could show the latest video of content, right? So evangelicalism had its sensibility as well. Well, and I'm suggesting that there's a new age that's dawning. And if the Agrarian Age gave us the parish model church, if the Industrial Age gave us the denominational church, if the Information Age gave us the evangelical church, then this new age that's dawning, what I call the Inventive Age, what kind of church is that going to produce? And I would like to suggest that that's the experiment, that's the goal, that's the circumstance that we all find ourselves in. In fact, the simple situation that we are communicating a webinar on Inventive Age over the internet, where I'm sitting where I am and you're sitting where you are, and we're making this kind of mashup thing happen, that's Inventive Age sensibility in and of itself. But I don't think it all has to do with the internet alone, any more than churches were about farms, or churches were about factories, or churches were about televisions. I don't think the Inventive Age is simply about the internet. I think it's about the sensibilities that go into the Inventive Age, not just the singular tools that we would have. So I would suggest that in this Inventive Age, there's a particular way that we're going to take this. A particular writer who's been helpful to me in thinking about this, named Daniel Pink, refers to this, a part of what I call the Inventive Age. He refers to this as the conceptual age. And I like the Inventive Age because at the start I was going to call it the idyllic age, which was the Agrarian Age, then the Industrial Age, then the Information Age, and then the Inventive Age. See, they were all I's. That was my singular genius. But he calls it the conceptual age. So Daniel says, we've progressed from a society of farmers to a society of factory workers to a society of knowledge workers, and now we're progressing yet again to a society of creators and empathizers, pattern recognizers, and meaning makers. I think that's a big deal. So what kind of a church is it that we would see that's built around creativity, empathy, pattern recognizing, and meaning making? So I want to suggest that that's what the Inventive Age is about. And in one of those books I'm not going to talk about today, but one called The Community Inventive Age, I try to suggest 10 components of Inventive Age culture that matter: meaning making, community formation, relational authority, participation. And participation, by the way, means something more than just singing along the songs. It means actually participating in the creation of. Dialogue as opposed to one-way communication. Abundance notions. There is enough. So I get all Wendell Berry about all of this now, where it's like all we need is what we already have, and there's enough. We just have a distribution problem. And the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed yet, sort of sensibilities. I think open source belief is an incredibly important part of the Inventive Age. Beauty, over efficiency, integration rather than distinctiveness and separation, which is a really big deal. The information age tended to want to break things into discrete packets of understanding and of comparison, and I think inventive age sensibility wants to integrate things together. And then a sense of ownership, that people feel like they're part of it, that they own it. They're not just a user of culture and of life, but they find themselves part of it. So I think those are some sensibilities. Now, in this notion that there are a culture, let me jump ahead a bit. Hang on a minute. I want to show you all this, but I think I'm a little bit out of order. Okay. There was something I was looking for, but I chose not to include it in this PowerPoint. So hold tight with me for a minute. I would suggest to you that in the area of thinking and values and aesthetics and tools, that's what forms a culture. So when we have a change in thinking, not just how we think, but what we know, and not just what we know, but how we think. So the shift in culture has to do with the knowledge that we hold and the way we go about processing that knowledge and information. And a shift in values, which has to do with how we order the world in its importance, right? So does a church think it's more important that it start and finish on time, or that everyone has a voice? Does a church think it's more important to do something with excellence or to do something with inclusion? And they don't have to be mutually exclusive, but sometimes we have choices to make. Does a church think it's more important that things look crisp and professional, or is it more important for things to look homemade and organic? These are the kinds of values that people hold. And then there's aesthetics. What's the smell? What's the color scheme? What's the sound level? What's the beat? What's the rhythm? I mean, all of us know what it feels like to walk into a building and say it smells like a church, right? We know what churches smell like, and smells and looks and color and all that matters so much. You might notice that our church building, from the pictures that I showed you, look very much, is very colorful. Every wall in the building now has a color on it. When we moved in, every wall in the building was white, truly. Every wall was white. And we ran into someone who came into the building a few months after we moved in, and we had put color on all the walls. And the woman said, "How did you decide on the color scheme that you were going to have?" And we said, "Well, we just assigned different rooms to different people and said, this is your room, this is your area, hallways or stairwells or whatever, and you are in charge of making it, putting color on the walls. So you can coordinate with people who have adjoining rooms or not, or you just do it, but it's up to you." And in 1 week, we were able to paint the entire building because people were assigned, and everyone had input who wanted to have input, but we didn't say that one team of people had to sign off on it. Everyone created as they wanted, so it all happened very fast. And this person who was looking at the building said, I was on the church council here for 11 years, and the only color we could ever agree on was white. And it was very interesting that their sensibilities in the church was full agreement that everyone said, yeah, that's the color, was more important, and they would wait on that and which left them only with no color on the wall. Where our sensibility was give everyone the freedom to put the color that makes sense to them, and then we learn how to live with that with one another. So aesthetics are incredibly important. And then there's the tools that we use to communicate and to structure. Tools have everything to do with how's the furniture organized. Tools have to do with, do we use microphones or not? Tools have to do with the structure of a sermon. They have to do with how you do. They have to do with everything you do is a tool, is a way of functioning. So it's my suggestion that the thinking and values are kind of ideas levels, and aesthetics and tools are kind of these objects that we have. And evangelicals and Pentecostals are very open and free when it comes to aesthetics and tools. Evangelicals, Pentecostals, they will say any way you need to do it, you can do it. You can wear jeans, you can wear a suit, you can wear a robe. Nobody really cares. It could be a bathrobe or a choir robe. You can meet on Tuesdays, or you can meet on Sundays. You can meet at night, you can meet in the morning. You can look and feel, and you can have drums and contemporary music, or you can have specialized music from a previous time. None of that seems to matter, as long as the content stays the same. Change the method, but never change the message. Change the container, but don't change the content, right? Very clear sensibility for evangelicals. Mainline and denominational folks have said, look, people's thinking changes. I mean, look, if our thinking didn't change, we would still be rolling around with ideas from 500 years ago. Of course our thinking changes. You can't keep the message the same because our values have changed. I mean, in North America, in the United States, we've had very rough history with our indigenous populations, and we've realized we haven't treated them well. We've had very confused relationships with different genders in our country. Of course our values are going to change. In the United States, we used to own people as property and not as a human being. I mean, to say that our values should stay the same is just not in touch with reality, say the mainliners and the denominationalists. So you have to change thinking and values. Progressive liberal theology might come out of this sort of notion. But then they become like evangelicals and Pentecostals by saying, of course, thinking and values can change as long as the aesthetics and the tools stay the same. So keep the aesthetics and tools. Make sure you sing out of the hymnal. Make sure the music style doesn't change. As long as the door stays, pick your color. As long as the system and the aesthetics and the tools stay the same, you can have freedom in thinking and values. And I'm suggesting that in the inventive age, it's going to require a change in all of these areas. Changing content and changing container. That not only a methodological change, but the message changes. That creates freedom for some of us and real anxiety in others, because people start to say, well, how could you have anything representing church if you're going to have this level of change going on? It just doesn't seem reasonable or possible. So there are some who like to have the suggestion that we have to have boundaries. We have to have fences. We have to know when you're in and when you're out. And if everything is changing, then I wouldn't know what it means to be the church or the national church or the evangelical church or the Presbyterians or whomever it is. How would we know who we are? And then others say, look, you can't live with these kinds of boundaries because if you put up boundaries like a fence on a playground, we all know what's going to happen. Something's going to be on the other side of that fence and you're going to want to get to it. So these kinds of boundaries just don't work. And so some people's suggestion is not to have boundaries, but rather to have center set ideas, from the bounded set to the center set. And the center set idea would argue, don't put a fence around the playground, rather put the playground as the most attractive thing, and then people will be attracted to that. So they would say, don't put up boundaries that keep our theology or our practice or our aesthetics or our tools in place. Rather, let's agree on the things that are essential to us. Let's have the few things that we gather around in the essentials, clarity, and in the non-essentials, charity, this kind of thing, right? Well, when the bounded set people hear the center set people say, don't have boundaries, just put the attractive things in the middle, they would say, well, that can be a little bit dangerous because you never know what can come wandering into the playground, right? How do you keep the bad things out? They don't like it. And the center set people are like, look, let's not be fearful. Let's rather have something attractive at the center. And the bounded set people are concerned about that. Then when inventive age folks like me come around, we like to say, I don't think center set solves the problem either, because now we're just going to argue about what's included in the playground. So rather than moving from bounded set to center set and being happy with that, or having limitations and then trying to have something held in common as that which creates it, rather we could think about not even having a playground at all, but knowing that children, when they come, would bring their own toys to play with. So we don't have an existing playground. Rather, everyone involved helps to generate the very thing that we're going to do. So you move from bounded set to something called relational set. The internet is based on this. There's no boundary to the internet. Rather, there's a system that's created with protocols and hard drives and servers and connection points. And the content itself operates within that system, but there's no boundary to it. There's no limit to it. I can say anything I want, and then you can like it or not like it, but we're organized around a different way. And not only was it the internet that's organized that way, all fractal theories. In fact, all the cosmos is organized around a very similar thing. But our families are organized that way too. This is family models, right? We know that in our families, we're organized in lots of different ways in our families. For some of us, we're in families with people we have a biological connection to. We share genetic code. And others of us are in families where it's social agreement. I live in a family where my wife and I have produced 2 children by merging our genetics, and each of us have a biological connection to those children. But my wife and I don't have a biological connection to one another. In fact, that's against the law in Minnesota to marry someone with a close biological connection to you. So we are together by social agreement. And then we've adopted 2 children who have a biological connection to one another. They're biological brothers, but they're part of our family because of social agreement. So there's no boundary. There's not even some one thing in common. Rather, we're a complex relational set. And we all know families are like this. You'll go to, a family get-together or some kind of a holiday meal, and you'll have to introduce your Uncle Bill to somebody, and they'll say, "Oh, well, whose brother is Bill? Whose brother is this?" And they'll say, "Well, he's not actually an uncle. My dad went to college with him, but I've known him my whole life, so I just call him Uncle Bill." Right? Or a ex-grandma that married in, or a new grandma that married in. So we have these very complex systems that work really well for understanding how we fit in the world. And I would suggest that the inventive age is going to be built around those kinds of sensibilities, where there is not a bounded set, there's not a center set, rather it's a relational set sensibilities. All right, so what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about preaching and about the role that preaching plays in this. So if you take all of this theory and you think about it in terms of what it means for preaching, the preaching, I think, then becomes an engaged dialogical activity of a community that is going to generate and create sermons, content with one another. So it's my suggestion that we get away from bounded set or center set systems for our communication style, and rather we learn the skills to create preaching as a collective act of our community. So in the book Preaching in the Inventive Age, I try to suggest a model that I call progressional implicatory dialogue. Progressional meaning that it progresses and moves from one idea to the next, depending on who's in the room. That it's implicatory, that it implicates us, rather than a sermon of application. So rather than asking ourselves, how does this text apply to people, we say, how is it that we are implicated by these ideas? And then dialogue becomes engagements of different people with one another, listening and being changed by what the other person is saying. Now, I was trained to do preaching in what I refer to as a speech-making model. So in the speech-making model, my job was to come up with the contents that I could deliver to the widest audience of people in the clearest way possible. And I would use many models to do this. I could use stories. I could use alliteration. I could use narrative. I could use 3 points or 1 point. And I experimented with all kinds of ways for me to figure out how to create a better speech so I could deliver a content to a group of people in the most acceptable way to their hearing. And I found that to not get much further at all than in creating a life of inventive age sensibilities than standing up and just reading something. The margin of difference between a really great narrative sermon and a really boring narrative sermon wasn't much of a difference. In other words, being a really, really good speech maker, or doing a thing that I refer to in the book as speeching, spelled S-P-E-A-C-H-I-N-G, like preaching and speech making, that being a better speecher didn't create much different outcome than being a not very good speecher, because the problem wasn't the content or my ability to do it. It was the relationship of that content to the people. And I think that as Christian communities, our role is to be better communities at preaching by involving more contribution in a different relationship. So the relational issue is who owns the content? Where did it come from? Who has intention behind it? So no matter what style of preaching I was doing, as long as I owned the content, as long as I controlled the pacing, as long as I had the intention of where this was going to go, the relationship to that content was the same. And what I think we suffer from in Inventive Age culture is preaching that is influenced by Industrial Age and Information Age thinking as opposed to Inventive Age thinking. So Inventive Age thinking wants to get back to those other sensibilities of meaning making and participation and generative thought. So how does one then create an environment in which participation in the sermon activity is most important? Now, what I discovered at Solomon's Porch was not only was I trained in how to be a good speaker, the people who like going to churches enough where they'll show up week after week had also enculturated enough to be good at being listeners to speeching. So there was already a deal in place. Like some people really like that speech making thing. They like it when they show up and I've spent 10 hours or 15 or 20 or, I've never gone so far as to do 30 or 40 hours of preparation for a talk. But if I spend a lot of time on it, they loved it. If you can put together a really good talk, people are like, that's awesome. That was fantastic. And I don't think any harm is done in a one-time speech-making act. I don't think a lot of good is done with it either. I think over time, though, that like repetitive stress disorder, we start to be shaped, informed, and end up with some limitations and liabilities that come through speech-making. That's really a problem. So what I want to suggest is that speech-making needs to be an occasional act, but not the normative act. It needs to be a dessert and not the main course. It needs to not be the thing we typically do, but something that can be done on occasion because it can accomplish a certain outcome. But the things that are done on occasion have one effect, and the things that are done repeatedly have another. It has been shocking to me to notice how many people have gone to church for 20, 30 years, 30, 40, maybe 50 weeks a year. They've been to a lot of religious meetings and still have the sensibility that they don't have anything to say to the other people in the room. And I don't think we want to create the kinds of systems that create groups of really, really good listeners. I think we want to create systems that produce really good contributors. Now, not everybody has in them the wherewithal to do a 20-minute talk or a 10-minute talk. But people do have the ability to share an idea or a 2-minute talk or sometimes longer. Everyone has something that they can share. And I think part of our job as preachers is to curate the circumstance by which people can contribute. So, all right, maybe we should open this up for a bit of question and answer at this point, so we can get into some of the tactics of what does it mean to be in a preaching environment that's built around these kinds of sensibilities.
Hi, Doug. I'll invite people to
Lydia, but,
type their questions into the chat pod, and I see one has just
okay,
come here from
let's try
Lydia.
some questions. Now, I don't remember, are people going to say questions or are they only going to type questions? I can't remember what our agreement was on how we're going to do this. Great. Okay, Lydia, thank you for that question. Here's what I think are some of the alternatives to the Speech-Making Act, and that is for communities to ask one another what their to share what they have to offer. And there's a couple ways that can happen. In our community, what we do is we try to create an environment in which people's expectation is that the sermon is owned by all of us. So we do a sermon every week. It can take 30 minutes or longer, but it's a communal activity. So the way we do it is we'll often have the sermon be based around an annotated reading of an entire book of the Bible. So it's kind of one of our things, right? So we're reading the book of Romans right now, and last week we read chapter 8 of Romans and had people engage with it. And this week we're going to do chapters 9, 10, and 11. 3 chapters, because there's sort of one thought that's carried all the way through chapter 8, and then a thought that's carried all the way through chapters 9, 10, and 11. So what we'll do is have this reading where up on those screens that you saw in the room, we'll have the text of last week, chapter 8, and this week of the 3 chapters, that will have portions, and every time the screen changes, a different person is invited to read. And then we make commentary on the way through. Now, what we do is we do a Tuesday sermon discussion group the Tuesday before that Sunday sermon. So last night, we had a sermon preparation group where there were 9 of us there, and we decided how far we would go, how we could talk about this, how we could invite people to participate in it, and we would shape the sermon together. And part of my role is to not only add my own voice, because I do think it's important that for me and for many other people who lead church communities, that they have a voice as well, right? I don't think it's my job simply to just be the facilitator and ask, well, what does everybody think, right? I'm not just a question and asker facilitator. I'm a content provider as well. And we want everyone to be that way, to feel like they're a content provider. So where does my voice fit in? Where do other people's voices fit in? How do we create a context that could elicit most involvement? So in our church, it's a very free form. Anybody can ask anything, they can say anything at any point in the reading, in between slides or at the end. So it's very open framed. Anyone can say it, right? Well, that involves a certain style of facilitator. Like, you have to be pretty good at that style to be able to do that with a couple hundred people in the room, right? That's a hard thing to do. I don't know that it's any harder than having to stand up in front of 200 people and keep them interested for 10 or 15 or 20 minutes week after week. That's pretty hard too. And nobody's good at that sort of right out of the chutes, right? We've all developed skills at being good at that. And facilitative leading is also a skill set that people have to develop. And I wish seminary, when I went to seminary and I got a master's degree in being a religious person, I had 3 different courses in preaching that lasted like 11 weeks each. Like, it was like 30 weeks of preaching classes, right? And interpersonal communication or facilitative action, I had 1 class session in 1 Christian ed course on that. So we are training people to stand up and give speeches and not training people on how to be good facilitators. Anyway, so that's something our seminaries and pastor training schools are going to have to address. But so in our case, it's very open source, very free frame. That doesn't work for everybody. It doesn't work in every tradition, and it doesn't work with everyone's temperament. So there's other things that people do to elicit this. I was just doing a preaching seminar on this with some friends down in Florida, the Episcopal Diocese of Florida, and one of their people said what they do is they at their church is something similar, but instead of having an open sermon discussion group on Tuesday and then an open conversation on Sunday, they ask 3 people to participate in any series that they're doing. So say they're going to do a 7-week series on whatever topic they're choosing to do. They'll ask 3 people, like pick a high school kid, a stay-at-home mom or dad, and a business owner. And for each series, they'll ask a different group of people then to work with the pastor on putting the sermon together, so it's a set group and they can build some confidence in one another. And then before the sermon for this week, they have people respond from the sermon last week for the more processing temperamented people, right? Introverts who like to take a little more time to think about their response. Where in our setting, like, you have to be able to think really fast to be able to make that work. But in their setting, they wanted to give people a week of responding to the sermon from the previous Sunday. So the pastor would deliver ideas, and a week later, people would come back with responses. Other people have done that a little more timely, where they would pick 3 or 4 people, and they would have them respond right after the sermon. So rather than there being an open room where you say to, a couple hundred people, I don't know, what do you all think about all that, right? They have these people who have chosen to work hard on these ideas be the ones who are going to respond. And so they're teaching and learning a way of dynamism. Other people use small groups. They'll do a 5-minute part of a sermon and they say, talk to somebody around you about that. I don't know that the modality itself is what's most important, right? Do you have someone prepare ahead of time their response? Do you have someone respond on the moment and they knew they were going to respond? Do you have that be an open situation where someone doesn't know they're going to respond, but they're sort of struck by it, or they talk to each other? I think all of those modes and dozens of others all work. What's most important to my thinking about this is not what style of engagement is happening, but what best helps people feel that they're as responsible for the content of preaching as the professional is responsible for the content of the preaching. This is what you would do in any adult learning environment, right? You want the learner and the facilitator to both feel that they're contributing to the learning process. And so I think there's a number of ways that that this kind of
Wendy had a question.
And so on. Can
That's
happen.
the only one I see here, Doug. And you did touch on it a little bit, but I wondered if you had some more to say about that, on the differences between introverts and extroverts in participation.
Yeah. Oh boy, it's huge. So it's really curious. The people who come on Tuesdays, like we have kind of a regular group. It might be anywhere from like 9 this week and maybe up to 15 or 20. There's about 30 people or so who come to the sermon discussion groups out of our whole community. At any given week. Those people who tend to come on Tuesday nights rarely say anything in the large group on Sunday. They rarely respond. They'll talk for an hour and a half or be part of a conversation for an hour and a half on Tuesday nights where it's a smaller group of people and they have a chance to really think about it, because a sermon on Sunday night will be done in 25 or 30 minutes as opposed to an hour and a half. So in an hour and a half setting, there's a little bit more time for some reflection or, last week we talked about this and I've been thinking about that. They rarely say anything on Sundays in the large group. And the people who really like to say things on Sunday in the large group and, very often will raise their hand, or we do snappings because we're in the round, so you don't know if someone's raised their hand, so we do this snapping thing. Who will sort of snap attention. Many of those people who say things all the time on Sundays rarely come on Tuesdays, right? Because they like the quick thinking. They don't need to think about it. They don't want to talk about it for an hour and a half. They're ready right now. They're external processors, not internal processors. So we've had to think very deliberatively in our community, which is built more so around my sensibilities, which is fast talking and lively thinking, to create space for other people. In some churches, the sensibility of the organizers might be a little bit more process oriented, so they might have to build in some ways to get the fast thinking and the external processors engaged. But I think that's a really important dynamic to consider if you want the entire community to respond. So the way we've tried to moderate that a bit was to invite people in the summer months where things in Minnesota change a lot for life and churches and everything. We invite anyone in our community to sign up to do a soapbox sermon, as we call them, where you get to jump up on your soapbox and let us have it, right? So you get to just preach at all the rest of us on any topic you want. And sermons can either be 10 minutes long or 20 minutes long. And every Sunday we'll have 30 minutes worth of sermons. So a 10-minute and a 20-minute, or sometimes 3 10-minutes. And so we invite people to do these 10-minute and 20-minute sermons that they can prepare and do on anything they want. And then they can just stand up and have full 10 minutes to kind of let us have it. And now the introverts are like, hey, now I got that one. I mean, if you give me 10 minutes and I have 3 months to prepare it, I can come up with some great material, right? It's really good for those people. Other people would be like, hey, I signed up for a 20-minute sermon on Sunday, and it's like Wednesday before, and they're like, I haven't really thought about what I'm going to do yet, so I'm going to really give some thought to that, right? Because they're just going to wing it, and they're just going to say what's sort of impassioned in them right now. So that created a space for people. Then we realized there were some people who didn't like a 10-minute thing or a 20-minute, but they had 2 minutes in them. So now we have a kind of sermons that we do occasionally 4 or 5 times a year, where we invite people to do 2-minute sermons. So you can either come with a 2-minute sermon prepared, or you can do one in the moment. So we'll have 20 or 30 minutes worth of sermon, and we can get 10 or 15 people who can give 2-minute little sermons on whatever they want. And they're fantastic. Because now what you have is this whole mix in the room, whether it's the 20-minute sermons or the 10 minutes or the 2-minute sermon, where you're hearing all these ideas and these people, and they're starting to layer together. And you begin to realize that over time, this community has a way of preaching and a way of saying things to one another, where all these voices are coming together in what our scientist friends like to call chaos theory, where patterns start to emerge about what God is saying to us, what our community is impassioned about, what we've been hearing and what we've been seeing. And these are the kinds of dynamics that say to people, you have something to contribute. And it doesn't have to be on message. It doesn't have to fit inside of a certain frame. You are the people who generate and create this. You bring the toy
Doug, I've really
bag,
appreciated
rather
your
than
sharing
having to talk
today
about
and
the 5 things that
around
we've all
this way
decided
of
we're
looking
going to
at
agree
things
on,
that are
or
happening
the
in our
3 things that we
culture
decided are important for us
and
to think
our
about.
church's response to it, particularly in preaching. I'm really excited to try these ideas out myself someday. We have one more question here from Wendy. I'm conscious of the time. I know that we promised people this would be a 1-hour webinar. I'm very curious about your answer to this question, so I think I'll just invite people to stay on if they'd like to do that while you take this one last question. But
1
first,
hour.
Doug, I'll ask if you're open to that.
Sure. Yeah. The question of do we have people with the question is, do you find that you have a broad theological spectrum, and if so, how do you handle this? Yes, we do have a broad theological spectrum, and I would like it to even be more broad if we could. But I mean, there are people all the way across the board. We just had a very impassioned election in this country on the, for the presidency, but also in our own state on important social issues, and we have people across the board on that. We have people who come from different traditions, theological traditions, Catholics and Lutherans, and people for whom like the deep theological presuppositions already, Calvinists, Buddhists, people who've given up on religion altogether, atheists and Pentecostals. Like, it is unbelievable the kind of thing that happens. On Sunday in the sermon we were having on chapter 8, there was a guy who comes from a preteristic viewpoint, which I don't know if you know what preterism is, but it has to do with end times, and that there was a fulfillment of end times that happened in AD 70. And he really thought that the content we were reading is really reshaped if you think about things in terms of preterism. And then there's another guy who, in the passage in chapter 8 of Romans, has this thing about the Spirit interprets our groans with the Spirit's own groans before God, right? So we don't know how we should pray, but the Spirit interprets with groaning. And he said, I think that's Paul's reference to something that we would call like speaking in tongues. And I said, oh, do you do that? Do you speak in tongues? And he said, yeah, I have like this prayer language. So I was able to say from my role, like, look, if that seems interesting to you, or if you only think people who do that are crazy, Daniel's not crazy. So if you need to be around somebody who's like, that's not what I do, that's not my tradition, I don't do that at all. But if that's something that is intriguing to you, you should talk to Dan about that, because he's really interested in that. And if this preterism thing is interesting to you, you should talk to Michael about it. If that's where you find yourself and those are interesting ideas. So I feel like part of my role is not only to try to convey my ideas about this, but when people share other ideas, to structure them and to to frame them in a way that strangers to those people could feel the invitation into hearing from those people. So on that case, I said very bluntly what we've been trying to say as a community for 12 years, and that is, when people share things in this community, take that as an invitation to join with them in how they're thinking about it. Now, you may want to take that invitation or decline the invitation, but don't just hear it as an idea that someone's communicating. Think of it as an invitation into their way of thinking. And I think that's a Christian sensibility that keeps us open to the work of the Spirit, because if God's alive and working in our world, if God's speaking, God's probably not speaking the same way to everyone or in the same pacing or at the same time in the same way. So the best thing we can do is to try to hook into other people's experience with God in ways that we wouldn't otherwise naturally do it. So I really like there to be varying spectrums, there to be a spectrum of theological opinions. Sometimes I worry that we're going to start to sort of cluster around certain ideas and certain ways of viewing the world, and that becomes a little bit dangerous. I don't fear people saying things that are considered heretical, because I'm convinced that people don't believe things because they heard someone say it. So someone can stand up in that room and say any blobbity blob that they want, and I don't think anybody in the room is going to be like hypnotized into believing that. If that were the case, they would all believe the way I think anyway, because I've been yabbering at them for 12 years. So I know that doesn't work. So, and I say really great things in my view. So I'm thinking, well, if that person says some nutty thing, that's fine. And nobody has to feel like they're speaking on behalf of Solomon's Porch, or that they're the people, that they're representing what we say. Now, I know some traditions that's the case. The sermon is the place where the fence is put up or the center is reinforced. So in those situations, yeah, they would have to think about it differently. But I think it might be fair, whether it's weekly or monthly or yearly, to say, let's have sermons or a kind of sermoning, kind of preaching, where it's designed to open
Doug,
rather than to reinforce what we already think. Do people share in progressional implicatory prayer? Okay, can I just put a little plug in Wendy's question? Yes, we do the same thing. I wrote another book. I'm not just trying to sell books. But I wrote a book called Body Prayer with people from our community, where we use our bodies as the things that we pray. So when somebody has a prayer request or something about prayer, we ask people in our community if they would suggest a posture that we could take to engage in that prayer. So we try to do the same thing with prayer.
And I think dialogue, which is what you've been talking about, is so important, and seeing dialogue in our communities as an invitation to journey with each other. I really like that image that you've shared. Well, we have passed our hour, and I want to thank you so much, Doug, for being with us, and I'm sure I echo the thoughts and sentiments of our participants as well, and we hope that you'll join us again sometime. Just a reminder to the participants that the webinar will be available, the recorded version of it, a week or so following the webinar, and you will receive an email notice about that.
I'd love to.